All right, here we go. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions, everybody. We are going to be doing the second episode for a new video series here on the channel called Help Action, where I kind of do an interview and Q&A, just a kind of a discussion about RPGs. I have a guest on to discuss a specific topic. Tonight, the topic is going to be setting tone in your RPGs. And tonight, I have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Alan Holloway. So, Alan, you son of a bitch, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be here.
I got you pushing pencils. No.
Yeah.
So yeah, let the people know kind of where you're from, what you got going on. Plug what you want to plug, and then we can get this ball rolling.
Sure. Yeah. My name's Alan, and I run the YouTube channel Check for Traps. Basically, a lot of live plays there, and I mean that's basically a lot of what I run is just live plays. And from Texas, though I've moved around the country a little bit and I travel a lot, but home is Dallas, Texas, and I mean that's all I got. So
Perfect. Yeah, you should be able to find the link to Check for Traps in the description of this video. Go over there, say hi, drop a subscription, drop a like, comment on his videos. Some of his games are kind of what we'll be talking a little bit about tonight, as a matter of fact, because Alan is a master, an absolute master at setting tone. I've played in several of his games that were in cartoons or comics, other established settings, a setting of his own, and all of them are fantastic. They're all really, really flavorful, very genre specific or tone specific campaigns where or one shots or what have you that have really, really captured the essence of whatever he's chosen to set his games in, and which is why I'm having him on tonight. So, to get us started, I have a question. One of the questions that I always find fascinating about people is how they got their start in the hobby. Um, so, when did you take your first steps into this strange land of mysterious tomes and funny dice? How did your journey begin?
So for me, growing up, I played a lot of like Legend of Zelda and stuff like that on the NES. So that was like my forte into the fantasy genre. And then my mom actually got me when I started reading, a little bit more of the heavier stuff. My mom actually got me The Hobbit and the whole like Lord of the Rings set. So that was probably my first fantasy novels that I got into. And then getting into role playing games, it was kind of like on accident. We were in the mall, and there was a bookstore in the mall. I think it was a Books a Million or something like that at the time. And it was just looking through. I think they had like a game section where they had all these game books, and there was a box set, and it wasn't the red box, but it was tail end of TSR, right before Wizards bought them out. So it was probably one of their like last box sets of second edition. But if you're familiar, it came with this like yellow dice pleather bag that had the TSR logo on there. All the dice were a different color, and it came with pre-made character sheets of the standard classes, wizard, cleric, and everything else like that. And I just got hooked on it. I was fascinated by here are these different character sheets, and it could be these characters and everything, and immediately just started asking my friends to play, and just kind of took on from there. And then, of course, once you're into the hobby, you find other people that of like, oh yeah, of course, we've been playing this for ever, like come into the fold. So I found others and just kind of grew from there.
So I guess you probably would have picked that up I guess that would have been what, mid to late 90s? I guess before Wizards bought them?
Yeah, it would probably be early 90s.
Early 90s.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure which date, when it was that Wizards actually bought TSR, but I knew it was somewhere in the 90s.
Yeah, because I remember like middle school, I was just getting into like Magic the Gathering,
Okay, yeah.
and this is basically just when they only had like basic and expert. That was like the only versions of the game out there for Magic was basic and expert,
Yeah.
and like Pokemon the card game had just came out, so I mean, it was just, it had to be at least like between 90 and 94.
Yeah. I want to say I started playing Magic in 94 because I know I was in high school, and it was it had only been out for like 6 months to like maybe a year and a half. So it's probably right around the same time that I started playing Magic, and I also started playing D&D around that same time when I was 14, in 94. Um, that's really cool. Like, did you find people to play with like through school or like in the
Yeah.
neighborhood or?
Well, I mean, oddly enough, so I had that box set, and I was reading it and everything, and but I was like, I don't know who to play this with or something, and there was still that whole like D&D is it's
Oh yeah.
bad, that kind of stuff. So there was still that stuff going on, but of course, all the middle school kids at the time were playing. They were either playing Magic or they were playing Pokemon on the Game Boy or whatever. So oddly enough, you find you playing with those people, and then they're like, "Hey, you ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons?" And I was all like, "Yeah." And so it's like, okay. So then we just me and like 5 other friends or so got together and started playing at a friend's house, um, and oddly enough, I had uh, I guess his mom was basically played D&D. So
Oh, nice.
she was basically like our first dungeon master.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah, and he he even got me introduced into like anime, because like one of the first animes I watched was Record of Lotus War, which was it's very D&D inspired.
Yeah, for sure.
And they had games like Dark Tower. I don't know if you ever played it. Dark Tower. It was like this. It's an old Mattel game, but it's
You talking
this.
about the board game?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Yes.
it's
Yes.
this old black plastic tower that you put like 40 batteries in. And you have to press this button. It's all like, oh, you encounter brigands and stuff. But yeah,
Yes,
like
I know the
that,
exact game you're talking about.
Yeah, games like that and Hero Quest. So it was just a natural progression.
So good.
To go from like those board games and go into D&D. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, my parents had that same Dark Tower game. I didn't know what it was, what it did. I just knew that the tower like lit up and made noises, and it was all like dark nights and like magic and all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, it's certainly something that also captured my attention whenever I was a kid. But I didn't start playing until I was, like I said, about 14, and I actually picked it up through the Boy Scouts. My scoutmaster is actually who taught me and several of my friends to play, and still to this day, about half of my D&D group is people that I went through Boy Scouts with, and every guy at our table is an Eagle Scout, which is pretty cool.
Very nice. Yeah, I have my best friend is actually the one that I was talking about who went over his house and his mom. He's still my best friend, and we still play RPGs together. So
that's awesome.
I mean, and then from there we've introduced new people and made new friends and keep up with them. So
Right.
I definitely could say probably the majority of my friends I've met through role playing. And I would say, at least in my experience, those friends that I've made through role playing have been more of my like lifelong friends than any other acquaintances that I've made in life. So
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, we go to each other's kids' birthday parties, and like we go like out of town together for New Year's and for 4th of July, and yeah, they're definitely the closest, dearest friends that I have, and I think there's probably a good reason for that, kind of hidden amongst role playing games. I mean, as obviously you're not actually going out and fighting dragons and things, but you've been through battle with these people, at least
Right.
in an essence, you know.
Well, I think also
led
you're
next
sharing
to them.
something. You're sharing something personal with them,
Yes,
right? It's
absolutely.
you're I guess you're exposing yourself to be a little bit vulnerable,
Hmm.
and I think you make a deeper connection. You're
Yeah,
like
I agree.
we can be nerdy in front of each other, not.
Well, and like role playing is kind of a safe place to practice a lot of like the challenging parts of life.
Mhm.
And so when you are standing side by side with someone that through those practices, when you go through actual tough times in life, sometimes you know that you can rely on those people. So those are the people you lean on or you contact, and they're the people that kind of tend to help you through the stickier stuff in life. And that's a really strong relationship if you can rely on someone like that whenever you, like you said, whenever you're emotionally vulnerable.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. Um, let's see. The first talking point, I guess we'll just start up at the top here.
Okay.
Uh, why is tone important in role playing games?
Okay. So I feel like tone is important in RPGs because just like any other form of entertainment, such as books, movies, music, television, video games, we want to immerse ourselves in the experience. We want to envision the narrative as if we were there. We want a certain level of energy to be carried at the table to help put our mindset into the story that we're trying to tell together. So tone is important because it sets the stage. It gets
Hmm.
everybody in the mood to where it's like when you're sitting down at a theater and the lights go down, you're like, okay, all my surroundings fade. What's in front of me is this, 100-foot screen I'm just going to be immersed in this world for the next 2 hours. And that's with tone you're trying to convey in that game session. Or at least that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think tone it helps a lot because it develops a shorthand between the entire table. It kind of gives you a cohesive understanding as to like what's generally at least going to be included in the game, and what may even be excluded, from the session or even the entire campaign. You know that if it's set in the Wild West, then more than likely you're not going to be dealing with laser guns and spaceships. And if it's a horror game, you're probably not going to be cutting up with the dick and fart jokes and things like that through the table. So laying down tone gives kind of this, like I said, a shorthand.
Yeah, I mean, it sets the difference between your gritty, like if you're running a gritty realism versus epic fantasy, right? Are you running Game of Thrones or are you running Masters of the Universe, right? Because if you're like, I'm going to run a Game of Thrones, and then everybody shows up and everybody's He-Man, that's definitely a different tone than the narrative of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure everybody knows exactly the kind of situation that we're talking about. Everybody has a story about when they sat down at the table and there was that one guy or girl who brought their character, and you were like, wait a second, man. Like, you named him Big Butticus? Like, come on.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not to say that that's wrong. But when you expect one thing,
Mhm.
having the tone established, and you get something that's adverse to that, it definitely can throw everybody off.
Yeah, because I mean, you want your players engaged. So if you're running a horror theme or political intrigue or something like that, and you're establishing the tone, something like Big Butticus is gonna throw off the tone that you're trying to convey as part of the game that you're trying to run. And hopefully, but I mean, before you sat down and you just started running the game, hopefully with you got with your gaming group and you said, okay, this is the genre and the tone that I'm going to run. Do I have that buy-in, right? So that hopefully you can bypass some of those hurdles before they can come up. So
Yeah, absolutely. And player buy-in is such a massive make or break point for the feel of a session anyways. Like if you have a large amount of buy-in from the table, then your energy is going to be much, much better. And the whole product of the evening, if you will, turns out much, much better. As opposed to if you have people who show up and they're just not into it, or they're kind of into it. It can make a big difference, I think.
Absolutely. And I've had it on both sides of the spectrum, right? I've had it to where I've had a game master say like, oh, I want to run a game of D&D. Just using that as that system as an example. So I want to run a game of D&D. Okay, well, what? Just make a level 3 character. Any kind of character, just make a level 3 character. So then everybody's just going to make whatever, right? Whatever they want to play, whatever they feel like, and you get to the table. And if that game master had a particular tone or genre in mind, but these characters are not made with that same, we're all thinking different things. So there was no cohesion in the tone and the genre that was set for this game, other than we were going to play D&D. So, I mean, we figured it's going to be fantasy, but that doesn't necessarily, just because it's the genre is fantasy, that doesn't necessarily set the tone for what the game is going to be at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, genre and tone are certainly not exactly the same thing. A lot of them kind of go hand in hand with each other. But we'll get to that in just a second. So we brought up kind of having a situation where Big Butticus has come to the game, sat down with his character sheet. How do you handle a situation like that? Like when somebody comes in and there's something that is so jarring that just doesn't mesh with what you have established, with what you have planned. How do you go about trying to smooth that out?
Well, I think my goal in that type of situation is to understand what exactly like the player is trying to accomplish, and see if I can steer them and their actions towards a middle ground, so that they both meet the tone and what they want to happen in the narrative. So it's a way of not saying no, but not having to stop the game. But with that being said, however, I feel like there are certain situations where you're just going to have to say, that's just not going to work. And explain why. That's not going to work. That's not going to work because, for instance, if you're doing the gritty realism and somebody wants to do cartwheels, backflips, and all this stuff across the room, you're just like, that wouldn't work in this situation, right? So you have to kind of play it back and forth. But I feel you want to be able to try to steer them as best you can. And again, that's absolutely why that buy-in is so important at the beginning.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there's a certain point where it just goes too far off the deep end, and you have to develop the capability as a dungeon master to say no. Like I know there's a lot of people out there that think that that's a horrible curse word as a DM, but like to not be able to say no opens you up to a lot of pitfalls. I think using it sparingly, and in this kind of case, I think just being able to say, "Hey, look, I understand. Like, I didn't go over this, or maybe you misunderstood kind of the tone of what we were going for. But let's dial that in. Let's try to find something that's a little more in line with kind of where where the rest of the table is." Yeah, you're not going to call your character Big Butticus. Sorry.
Right, absolutely. And you could probably curb some of that with like a session 0 if you have the time and the capability, right? You're making characters at the table, and somebody's like, okay, I'm going to make Big Butticus and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, that's probably a good idea for another game. This is what, this is kind of what I had in mind. Do you have any thoughts about a character that would fit in whatever the tone of this game, right? That way they can kind of get, okay, this is not a beer and pretzels kind of game, right? Mm-hmm. And it also gives them the opportunity, that sounds like a really great idea, but I'm looking for more of just like a hangout, have a beer or two, roll some dice. I'm not looking for like a heavy RPG kind of session, right? So it gives them the opportunity to bow out.
Yeah, it kind of hedges their expectations.
Right.
Yeah, I am a massive fan of session 0s for campaigns. Like, again, for a one shot, it's a little unnecessary. But for a campaign, I'm almost converted to the idea that it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, just getting all of those expectations kind of laid out ahead of time so that you don't have that kind of stuff that pops up either in the beginning whenever everybody finally sits down together or way down the road, which could, arguably even be even worse. It's nice to establish kind of what you expect as a DM, but also hear what your players are expecting out of the game, but also to establish your tone ahead of time to tell people, hey, this is the world that it's set in, whether it's an established, canon of universe of some kind or a one of your own design or what have you. And I think it's really, really important to establish those kinds of things up front.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could do that too in a one shot, right? If you're looking for players, you can hedge out the people by putting that in your post. Like, this is a one shot. It's a one and done. Here's the tone and the style that I'm going for. If that doesn't interest you, move on to the next post or whatever it is, right? Because like you could I'm looking for players who are interested in a horror survival game, or that you most likely, your character has a 90% chance of dying in the first hour of this game because that is the type of game this is, right? And if you're very clear about that up front, then hopefully you're going to get the players that post interest are the players who already have that mindset and they're okay with if their character dies in the first hour because they're expecting that type of game. So
yeah, you would think that players would read the interest posts closely, but
then
not always.
Then again, you see a Jeremy Lilly game pop up and you're like, I don't care what it is. I just want to play in a Jeremy Lilly game. Right. I'll figure it out when I get signed up.
That guy runs some weird games anyways. Yeah, but so we already kind of touched on this a little bit, but what exactly is the difference between tone and genre? I mean, I know the difference between the words, but maybe just we could go over a little bit about how establishing one kind of affects the other. Obviously certain genres work best with certain kinds of tones. When you're going to go outside the box, like you're running a comedic Cthulhu game or like a love story that's kind of set in the zombie apocalypse, kind of what are the considerations that you need to take when doing that? Are there any?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I definitely both can influence the setting, but the genre for me, like, establishes a framework or a foundation for the game, right? So, you're going to say this is going to be a high or a low fantasy game or horror game, a sci-fi game, spy game, political. That's your genre, right? So that already gets like a certain mindset going on. But from there, you're also going to set the tone. And a good instance of that is, so the Chrome City game that I'm running, that you're in, that's a sci-fi, or the supplement that we're using is a sci-fi genre supplement, right? But what you've done with that setting is you've created a cyberpunk tone, right? Because there's many different versions of sci-fi. This could have been a faster than light travel, like a Star Trek kind of thing. This could have been more fantasy, like a Star Wars, but this is a cyberpunk sci-fi. And then on top of that cyberpunk, I've focused more on a neo-noir tone to the story that I'm telling with you guys. So that's kind of a difference between genre and tone. We have a sci-fi genre. We layer that on top of with a cyberpunk genre and tone, and then we layer that even more so with another genre and or tone as well, which is going to be a neo-noir.
So it sounds kind of like tone is a subtype of genre, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to narrow down more specifically the feeling, right? We know it's a fantasy game. We know D&D is a fantasy game, but on what end of the spectrum, right? Are we going more Lord of the Rings, this like epic but low magic fantasy kind of story, or are we going more for your your World of Warcraft kind of stuff, where the magic is everywhere. There's flying mounts, there's world-shattering events, it's like every 10 levels, that kind of stuff, right? So the difference between one big bad and you're trying to save the world, and there's every 5 feet there's something going on, right, that you have to address. So definitely a difference in the tone between those two worlds, even though they're both fantasy.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think genre sounds almost like it might be better used to describe kind of the physical world that whatever story you're telling is taking place in, kind of the scope of the story and the places that you might expect, the set dressings, the way things look and sound, and the tone sounds like maybe it focuses a little bit more on the emotional aspect or the intellectual aspect of what setting you're going to be using to tell your story.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that, because you can sit there and you can tell a group of players. You could say, hey, I want to run a horror survival. I want to run a Walking Dead themed kind of game, right? And so if you're familiar with The Walking Dead, you have a certain tone, a certain aspect about that type of game in your head already. And then if you show up and the game turns out to be more of Shaun of the Dead, that that's different than the tone of a Walking Dead kind of game. It still has to do with zombie apocalypse, but it's definitely one's more your bear and pretzels kind of fun. We're having fun with this, right? It's the end of the world, but we're having fun with it. And one's like, okay, every decision we make matters. So
now I think you have to run a Shaun of the Walking Dead game.
Oh yeah, there we go.
And I'll play in that, please.
Exactly. It's like, okay, so the goal is to bar hop as many times as you can without getting eaten by zombies, and we'll see. We'll see who makes it to the end, right?
The number of bars that you've hopped is the number of seasons your show has lasted.
There you go. Yeah.
I still haven't seen Baby Driver yet, and I really, really want to.
It's good. You got it. I would recommend it.
I have to track it down. Awesome. Okay, so speaking of kind of established things in pop culture, when you're attempting to capture the tone of an established piece of pop culture, or like a previously existing setting, or something like that, there's like this. There's a wellspring for you to go to drink from, whenever you're looking for inspiration or you're trying to get ideas and things of that nature. But like I recently started a campaign that is set in a brand new setting of mine called Momentum. And it's a pretty unusual place as far as like pop culture media to like absorb. I can't really think of very many sources to actually draw from for inspiration that are similar in genre or tone. So in a situation like that, how would you go about finding your right tone, your proper tone?
Well, I mean, first I have to say, I mean, as far as getting yourself in the right mindset, first of all, thank the powers that be for the internet, because 10, 20 years ago, playing D&D, not having the internet, you're basically going with whatever book or maybe TV show that you had watched that would be influencing the type of tone or genre that you were going for. But luckily, with access to the internet, I mean, in your situation, what I would start with first is, what is the type of story that I'm trying to tell, right? Is this an epic journey? Is this a love story? Is this a war story? Is this a story of friends coming together? Is this a story about loss? So I'd find something that would relate to the kind of story I want to tell. And then based on that, I would go back to any sort of movies, books, a video game, something that made me feel the type of story that I want to tell. So, for instance, if I was trying, it's set in fantasy, but I want to tell a war story, and I figure out, okay, what kind of war story I want to tell what kind of tone do I want to tell. Do I want it to be like a band of brothers? Do I want it to be this kind of like Pearl Harbor kind of thing? And then I could go back to those genres or those sources, and I can rewatch that, or I can read a book that was similar, or Wikipedias are there, and then Pinterest. Thank God for Pinterest. All the imagery you can find to really help. Sometimes you just see an image and you're like, oh, that'd be a perfect NPC or a bad guy, or even just a locale. Like, that would be just this trench would be perfect for this inspirational thought I had about having this battle where the characters are stuck in this trench. And most of the session is just them arguing in the trench as everything else is exploding behind them until they finally make the decision to come out of the trench. Right. So that's how I would do it in your situation, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of, like you mentioned, art and movies in particular. Those are two massive sources of inspiration for me, and that's a really good idea. Like not focusing so much on the aesthetics, the genre, but maybe more the tone, like we were talking about just a minute ago, more the emotional side of things. So it may not have to be, it may not have to look and feel the same way as my setting, but more kind of where I'm trying to take the campaign emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Really and that may change too. That may change with how your players interact and stuff, because just my experience in playing with you and other people that we're familiar with in the different games that I've ran, and even the games that you've ran, I have felt that the tone change, be it from session to session or in the campaign that we were playing in, right? Maybe after two or three sessions, you had a particular goal, right, in mind, and there was a certain tone, right? That, for instance, in your Oriental Adventures campaign, the very beginning had a very different tone. It was more like we having to survive. We're being invaded and we have to like survive. It's all about taking care of ourselves, our party, making it out alive. We have to make it to the Emperor and relay this message like we're being invaded. And then once we got to that point in the story where we felt like, okay, we made it, we're here, we told the Emperor what now, then it became very different tone. Now we're in a war and we're fighting this battle. So we're taking the battle to the invaders. So it definitely changed. The tone changed in the story.
Yeah, that's a great point. And sometimes even the tone can change scene to scene, on an even smaller scale. There was a lot of scenes, particularly like with you and Scott's character, that were a little more comedic or, brotherly exchange of affection. Even though you guys weren't actually brothers, effectively that was the kind of relationship that you had. It was antagonistic, but in a lovable way. And then you'd be able to switch to a scene, like you said, with the Emperor that was very serious, had to be really super stoic. Was talking about a lot of really heavy things like the mass genocide and all kinds of crazy things of that nature. So I think tone is probably a lot more fluid than genre is.
Absolutely. And then to your point, yeah, you definitely, it's just movies and books do that all the time, where they have its ups and downs, right? And there's articles, and I would definitely, if you want to become a better storyteller, I would definitely look into just like writing, like, about writing or about telling stories or movies, that kind of stuff. But there's definitely an emotional tone roller coaster through books and movies. Even if something, a serious movie or a horror movie, you definitely have your moments where it's very intense. And then, the story has to bring the audience back down, right? We got to build you up and then we got to bring you back down, right? Because if we constantly keep you up here, it's too much, right? So we have to do the roller coaster to keep the tone and the momentum of the story flowing instead of constantly just keeping it up on high.
Absolutely. Yeah, the rising and falling kind of actions are imperative in any kind of story. You like you said, you have to have the moments where you let off the gas. Um, if you don't, you will wear your audience out. They won't be able to continue past a certain point, or they'll just be too high strung and stressed out, and they'll just want to be done with the experience. So giving those little breaks, it also gives you a bit of a reprise, so that you don't have to keep amping up, the whole time. It kind of lets you set things back a bit and start over with the building the tension. Um, so we talked about movies and books being a great source of inspiration. Another source of inspiration that I use constantly in my games is music. And I know that you and I have talked a little bit about music before. Personally, I find that it really goes a very long way to helping me establish a certain tone, especially if the music's kind of been cultivated into a specific playlist. Um, it really helps me kind of get my head in the right space. Um, is this something that you tend to utilize in your games, or just in your prep, or?
For me, well, first of all, I love your playlist that you hand out during the games. Those are always great. Um, Definitely helps put me in the mindset, especially when we were playing the Oriental Adventures. Even when we weren't playing, I would have, when I wanted to get my mindset back into my monk character, I would sit there and I would put like some Japanese Zen or Chinese instrumental music in the background or whatever, just kind of help put my mind into that genre and that tone that we were trying to convey during the storytelling. I use it more for my own prep. Um, I don't use it too much in my games, just because I try to limit the amount of technology or things I have to keep up with as a game master. If I know, most likely, if I had something that was like these these streaming technologies or in Sirenscape and something like that, to where I can set it and forget it, and everybody could hear it, and I didn't have to manage it or anything else like that, I'd probably utilize it more. Um, but currently, right now, I don't use it, just because for me, I feel like it would be one more thing I'd have to worry about, and I want to be able to focus on the players and what they are doing, and being able to set up the action and the scenario and the story.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I tend to use Spotify. So I kind of set up a playlist that I like, and like I said, I kind of vet it as I listen to it when I prep my notes and when I'm just thinking and driving in the car or whatever. And that way, hopefully, when it comes time for game time, I can just drop the link in there, and people who want to listen to it can, and that's awesome. I would love to figure out a way to be able to play the same song, so that everybody in the audience and at the table can hear it together, the virtual table. Um, but copyright issues are kind of sticky, so that's definitely not
Absolutely.
something
But I
that
agree.
I
I
can do.
mean, music can definitely help set the tone. I mean, like, you're in a combat, and if you have that music that has those like battle drums or some sort of just undertone of rhythmic bass, that gets everybody's like heart pumping, and it builds the excitement. And even though you're not physically exerting yourself, the music will build that energy at the table. And so you're sitting there and you're like, okay, what do you do next? What do you do next? What do you do next? And that you feel that excitement, you feel that energy there. Whereas if you were in a combat scene, and you were playing some meditation music, everyone would be very calm. Probably wouldn't be as exciting as you'd want it to be. So that's why if I was going to play music, I'd like it to sync as best as I could to whatever the scene was at the time.
Yeah, I agree, and that's certainly a problem that I run into, having a playlist that's on shuffle. Now I could break it down and do, like you said, the wuxia playlist. I could do the wuxia fighting music and the wuxia exploration music, and a lot of people do that. But I run so many different games and game systems and settings that, like, my playlist list, whatever that is, my library, that's what it's called. is already like I have like probably 30 different playlists. And if I started breaking each one of those out, like that sounds like a lot to keep track of. So that's what the next button's for me. So we have a question that is from Karen Davies. She wants to know, what are the most important things needed to capture the tone of the setting? Are there specific elements that you always make sure to include? Are there things that don't matter as long as you get the right elements correct?
That's a good question. I definitely, for me, I always, again, one, it depends on the genre. So like for Chrome City, I definitely spent a lot of time looking up images for like just cyberpunk, reading up on what is it? It's like a Wikipedia. I think it's like TV tropes or movie tropes, something like that. And it'll kind of break down any sort of genre. So I was breaking down like cyberpunk, noir, neo noir, and what are the underlying themes and tones for those types of genres. And then I would think, okay, how best can I convey this, right? So, and then of course, depending on the setting, so I knew it was Chrome City, so I knew there was a lot of neon lights. So whenever I described something, there needed to be neon lights in it. It needed to be that kind of techno punk music in the background. It needed, telling a noir story, so it needs to be raining all the time. The tone needs to be kind of dour, right? And then, and of course, as a noir story, there has to be a sense of mystery and a sense of edge at all times, or at least that's my experience when I've read or watched noir stories. And so I take those because there's only so much your brain can handle. So I try to take maybe the top 5 things, and then when I build my scene, I'm like, okay, so this is going to happen. The first scene is going to happen in a bazaar market. So what would be there? And I just bullet point. Okay, there's neon. There's these little like shops everywhere. It's raining. Boom. That describes the scene. And then just be very clear in your descriptions and setting that the tone of the environment. And generally, your players will catch on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is one of those things where the description is so vital. Like I use a lot of artwork when I run my games that I find all over the internet. And even with using a lot of art, I find myself still trying to interject description everywhere that I can. Almost everything has an adjective, so that it's an opportunity, like you said, to push the tone in the genre. It's a place to interject that without having to constantly go back and remind everyone somehow that, hey, this is what we're doing, this is where we're at, this is the framework that we're telling our story in. That's how tone and genre gets slid in, without it being overt.
Absolutely. When it comes to description, I mean, I kind of took this away from Fate, and Absolute Tabletop did this in their Oath of the Frozen King supplement, and I'm sure in their new Drift Chapel supplement it'll be there. But when you set your scene, pick like 3, no more than probably 5 aspects or bullet points that you would want to convey in that environment. Is there something about the temperature? Is there something about the smell? Is there something about the aesthetic of the room or the environment that you're in? Bullet point those things, and as you're setting up the scene, make sure you call those out so that they stick in the player's mind, right? If you're coming across a murder scene, there's a body, there's blood, there's a smell, you can even set a tone as far as like it's very somber, it's very dark in here. There's a sense of foreboding. You can set it not only as far as the sense, the 5 senses, but you can set it on an emotional sense as well.
Yeah, I agree. Hitting the senses, and you again, like you said, almost that sixth sense, the gut, the emotion that you kind of that you start to feel because of a specific situation. Those are very, very strong immersive tools as a GM, and I think there's a lot of people that aren't aware of how powerful those can be. Uh, I think the one that obviously gets done the most is sight. Um, Sound being the second. But smell is an incredibly evocative sense for us as humans. And it's deeply ingrained in memory and processing information. And we don't usually give it the kind of credit that is really due. So when you walk in, like you said, if there's been a body that's in this place and it's been rotting for a few days, the things that you're seeing and the things that you are hearing are not going to be the first things that your brain processes when you step into a place like that. The first thing that you're going to process is, what the fuck is that smell? And especially with, death and decay, like, I'm from Texas, so I've been around, decaying cattle and things like that. There's a very particular smell to a dead animal, at least, and I'm assuming that a dead human body probably has the same kind of smell, and it's something you don't ever forget. So when I walk outside and something anywhere nearby has died, I'm like, "Ooh, that's a dead animal. Ooh, there's something really close, and it's rotting." So again, it's just a very, very evocative sense that should be hit on more often than I think it usually does at the table.
I would definitely agree, and that sixth sense is definitely a big one too,
Hmm.
because there's a lot. I'm like, if you're trying to intimidate or scare your players in the current situation, right? Like they come across a dragon, I can almost always tell you that just saying it's a dragon, that's not gonna. Your players are still going to be gung ho to try to like take on that dragon. You could sit there and say it's got all these hit points, it's got all these powers, but unless you particularly sit there and you build a sense of you are overwhelmed, you're outmatched, the hairs on the back of your neck are standing up on end, you have your stomach, you have butterflies in your stomach just looking up at the sheer size of this creature. It's mere growl rumbles the earth beneath your feet, right? It lets out a sniff or a whiff of its breath, and just the dead meat smell coming off of it, right? Causes you to cover your mouth and back away. Those kinds of things, without even saying that it's a dragon, would convey a sense of, oh crap, what did we just walk into, kind of thing. So definitely the description is going to tell you more than just this is what you see, or this is what it is, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, like I said, I go back to it being a shorthand. With your description, you're giving your players clues to the things that you want them to pay attention to. You are giving them the hints of of how to set the tone, of how they should be behaving in this scene. You're kind of setting the scene, as it were. So that way they know that they're not, stumbling drunkenly out of the tavern, and it's been a great night and they're celebrating victory. You've established that this is a really dire situation, and that, like you said, they may be clearly outmatched, and it's going to set the way that everybody in that scene plays off of what you've given them and off of each other. So, um, one of the things that I like to talk about, I have another video about it on the channel, is called steeping, and that's like when I start down the path of a particular setting or genre or tone, for that matter. I tend to immerse myself in media that is related to that in some way, like we talked about, using movies for kind of the right emotional tone, or listening to music that is particularly chosen to get you in the mood for a specific setting or genre. So that's something that I use a lot. I really like for weeks on end, I will watch movies that are tied to the setting I'm trying to get into, listen to the music while I'm prepping. Is there a way in your prep work that you find that tone kind of shapes the kind of prep work that you're doing? Like if you're trying to prepare for a game that's, scary, do you prepare for that differently than you would for a game that's more lighthearted?
I would probably say so. I mean, I do the same thing for my prep. I mean, if I'm running, for instance, just like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game that I ran in, that you were in. I mean, I went back and I started rereading the comic. I went on YouTube and I watched clips from the old 80s or 90s, whatever it was, the original animated show. And I just kind of like immersed myself, and I was like, okay, what is this about? This is about brothers. Well, depending on whether you're watching the reading the comic or watching the animated show, but it's about brothers. So I definitely wanted to make sure there was a feeling of brother camaraderie. There was their brother and the father, right? And the brothers trying to find the approval from their father. So that was definitely an aspect there. And then of course that feeling, it's about ninjas, so we gotta have ninja action in there. So I had to make sure there was like plenty of like, okay, ninja type stuff. It's stealthy, it's dark, moving around, and then of course finding ninja clans. So, and then you have like Avatar that I ran. So I watched Avatar, and Avatar, number one, Avatar is an amazing animated series.
I'm gonna say that's a serious sacrifice you made there.
Yeah. But it's an amazing series, definitely a great story. And I mean, I felt like I did a lot of prep for that because I watched a lot, and I had to read a lot of wiki just to kind of like, okay, what are the type of creatures and where in the map and where in the world can this be? But you guys as players took that game just totally in a different emotional spectrum. I mean, you guys did that all on your own, and to me, it was one of the best things ever that happened that came out of that session.
Yeah, David went way off the deep end in a really spectacular way with that game. It was a lot of fun to be a part of it for sure. But that's a really good point about kind of being able to, when you're watching, when you're doing this, what I call steeping, how to distill the elements that are useful for what you are trying to get out of it. Because obviously, when you sit down to watch The Last Airbender for the first time, you didn't have running a game in the forefront of your mind. So you saw the entire series, or however much of it that you watched, through a different lens. And so that's why, going back, for me at least, that's why going back and rewatching specific movies is so important, because then I sit down with it in a completely different mindset. I'm listening to the terminology they're using, the way that they're speaking to one another, the kinds of things that I'm going to need to be describing whenever they're coming up in the game. Like you said, with a noir, you may not notice when you sit down to watch Blade Runner that it's raining pretty much through the entire film. It may not be something that sticks out in your mind. But if you are paying attention to it as a source of inspiration, and you're looking for things that you're going to have to describe during your game, then that should be one of the first things that jumps out at you. Rain and neon. Those things are strong visual elements that you can easily put into every description that you need to, and they're very evocative about the genre. So it's
absolutely,
it's definitely worth.
And I would definitely say, if you can, share some of that steeping with your players.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I started doing for a lot of my campaigns is sending my players a recommended watch list like of movies that I know of that I feel are good correlations that will help them steep. Yeah, and I think the more that you share steeping and that kind of stuff, the stronger the chance of everybody being on the same page. Um, it gets a much better established shorthand because you can reference things and most everybody will get it.
Absolutely. And it's a good way to hold in, like if you're running a campaign, or I mean maybe you're running a one shot and you have a lot of lead time before you run the game. It's a good way to hold that player's interest for the tone of that game, right? It's a way to like build it up or keep that interest in between sessions, because depending on, some groups, they only play like once a month, or less frequently than that. And you want to be able to hold your players' interest in the type of game that you're playing, and you don't want them to kind of come back to the table in a month and say, okay, what was the tone? What was the idea behind this game or whatever? And if you can keep that interest, then I know for me, when it's been a long time as a player, when I come back in, at least that week that I have a game on Wednesday. So then I start that steeping process, over the weekend or something like that. I watch a movie, or I play music in the background, or I start looking through imagery again, just to kind of put my mind back in that mindset, so that come game day, I'm there. I'm ready to get back into the world, and be that character that I was, or tell that from a game master perspective, tell that story that I was looking to tell.
Yeah, I think that makes really good sense, and I do a very similar type thing, like you said. If I know I've got a Western coming up, then guess what? It's Westerns for several days straight forward.
It's Tombstone all over again.
Tombstone. Yep, that's right. Luckily, in most of the genres, there's enough fodder to cycle through them without having to view the same thing repeatedly.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, well, I have just one last question that I want to ask you.
Okay.
This is not as much about setting tone. It's just kind of a question for you in general, but I think it's probably the one that we'll end up going out on here. So I know that you travel quite a bit, through the U.S. at least. And while I'm sure that the culture probably doesn't really change much from place to place that you visit, the way that it would if you were traveling abroad, say, but there's probably noticeable differences, I would imagine, in the different parts of the country that you tend to visit. Have you ever found anything that in your travels that has influenced your gaming? And can you think of any kind of specific examples that stand out in your mind?
I don't think anything in specific. I mean, I try, if I can, to visit game stores if there is one in the local city or town that I'm in. But I think for the most part, it's just more or less like people's mannerisms, in those different areas that I visit. And I kind of take that a little away, I guess, because I know when I'm at a client for a week, and let's say I go up in the New England area, before the end of the week, you adapt. So before the end of the week, my accent's changed, and I'm saying "use guys" and all kinds of stuff like that. And so that kind of helps. I wouldn't say I'm the best accent person by any means, but I definitely, when I'm building an NPC and I want it to have a certain type of accent, I kind of go back to, how did those, when I was there with those people, how did they act? Were they, they come off really brash? What was kind of the slang that they used? How did they hold themselves? And I try to like mimic that. Like how do I hold my body? How do I, do I cross my arms? Do I kind of slouch? And then I try to get into the accent to kind of convey that NPC. Or maybe I want to sit there and say, all my dwarves are grumpy New Yorkers or something. And so they're all going to act a certain way or something, so I probably take that probably most of all, but I haven't come across anything that was all like, yeah, gaming is different here versus there kind of thing.
Right. And that's exactly kind of the thing I was talking about, because even if you don't adapt an accent, just like what you're talking about, the way you hold your body, your mannerisms, the pattern of speech, the volume at which you might speak, uh, those kinds of things can have cultural norms kind of throughout different places. And I imagine that you probably had a wider experience, a wider appreciation for a lot of those kinds of things, because you tend to see a lot of places, which is really cool. Well, awesome, man. I don't have any other questions for you. So, unless you have any other points that you'd like to bring up, anything you want to talk about or shout at the people before we end this thing?
I don't have any other points, but I do want to say, and I know everybody who plays in your games tells you, but I have to say, I mean, you do a wonderful job in building your campaign worlds. And I know as a player and as a friend, I appreciate all the steeping that you do, all the notes that you share, the art that you share, the amount of preparation that you take to run these games. I know it takes a lot of your time, and it pays off, because I know I've had a wonderful time in playing in your one shot and your campaigns, and I can definitely tell all the hard work that you put into it. And that to me is, as a player to your GM, whether you do it at the table or you do it on a sidebar, let them know how much you appreciate the time that they take out to put this together for you and your group. It might not seem like much, but I mean, they put a lot of work into it. So hopefully you appreciate that too. So thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, you melted my cold little heart. Seriously, that kind of stuff means a lot to me as a creator. Knowing that the people that I'm creating stuff for enjoy it, especially to that extent, is a huge as a huge, I don't know, balm to my creative soul, whatever you want to call it. It makes me very, very happy. And especially speaking specifically about setting tone and genre, and having that compliment come from you, because as I said at the top of this, I think that you're probably the strongest, if not simply one of the strongest GMs that I've noticed, that nails that. Every time, every game that I've been in of yours, it shows that you understand what you want to create when you sit down to run a game. That you understand whatever setting or genre that you've chosen, and you go out on a limb to make that happen. And it's worth it very much. So, thank you very, very much for coming on and talking with me.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I love this kind of stuff. I could talk shop all day long. And having someone to talk with about it is so much better, because when I sit in front of the camera all by myself, I feel very awkward just talking and talking.
I feel the same way. I'm like, how do I want to have a conversation, but how do I have a conversation with myself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So having somebody to bounce these questions off of and talking points and kind of hash it back and forth is a format that I much prefer. Yeah, this is only the second one thus far, but we do have others planned. There will be a third help action at the end of this month. That episode will have Megan Hambrock, and we will be discussing invoking emotion, which she is very, very good at doing in her games. So I'm really excited about diving into that side of things. We touched on it a little bit through this.
Yeah, so Megan is phenomenal at that. I mean, even if you don't play, if you go and watch her games,
which you should,
hands down. And she's really good. When you talked about using music or sound, definitely re-bring up that question to her, because she does an excellent job. Her and Connor do an excellent job of of they do their own sound bites and all this stuff, and they know how to use it in the game to convey a certain tone or a certain feeling for the players. Especially in that last horror game that she ran, it was creepy as all get out. So she's excellent at that. Definitely recommend. Go check her out. But yeah, I look forward to these. I really enjoyed your first one. Thank you for having me as your second guest. I look forward for more of these. So yeah, I'll definitely be staying in tune. So
perfect, man. I greatly appreciate that. All right, everybody. So definitely go over to Check for Traps. Check out his traps and games and all of that. Give him a like, give him a sub. Watch his games. They are phenomenal. I cannot recommend them enough. Even though the Avatar game is like 5 hours long, it's worth it. Like just take it in bite-sized chunks. But I've been Jeremy. This has been another episode of Help Action. And until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.